Okay, so today we're going to start our section on privacy. Um, and so it's kind of important to note this is the first thing that we're going to discuss in the terms of this class that is not at all in the Constitution. There is absolutely no enumerated right to privacy in the Constitution. It simply doesn't exist. Um, but we oftentimes hear members of the Supreme Court, Congress, and other individuals within the US more generally very explicitly claim that there exists some right to privacy. And the reason why they do that is because over time the Supreme Court has evolved to recognize a right to privacy. And largely because privacy concerns are exceedingly broad. They cover a large area of which we're only going to focus a small bit upon in this class. And that partially plays on the reason of why privacy exists in this country, because the right to privacy in the country is articulated at its earliest instance, and when the court finally recognizes it in terms of sexual privacy. And so the origin of privacy rights in this country come from sexual nature. And so we're going to focus on sexual-based privacy in this course, because that's where the origin is and that's where a lot of the evolution takes place. But understand that there are large swaths of things that we're not going to talk about in terms of privacy, like privacy within one's home, privacy in terms of information, which will be exceedingly salient perhaps in the weeks to come. As you've perhaps heard, in countries that are handling, or at least theoretically handling the outbreak of COVID-19 better than the United States is currently, digital privacy rights can be given to the government. In South Korea, for example, in terms of a pandemic, certain your phone records and your credit card records can be made available to the public health service. And that's to help with things like content tracing. Now, within the United States, with explicit protection on privacy, that doesn't actually appear to be a possibility. And so the United States will have to get fairly creative if they want to use any sort of digital tracing with regard to the right to privacy. And Apple and both Google have been attempting to create a platform by which you can sort of anonymize that data, but that anonymous data won't be nearly as effective as the person-to-person data that exists within China, South Korea, Singapore, other nations that are doing this content tracing on the basis of your personalized information. And so privacy concerns are most likely going to become fairly salient over the next few months into the next year, as we consider how we weigh this individual level right to privacy against public health concerns that are more broad and generalized. But for the focuses of this class, we're going to talk about the origins of privacy. We're going to talk about how privacy gets started, and we're going to deal at least at some length with how these privacy concerns translate and evolve into a more specific protection with regard to a woman's right to choose and abortion rights going forward. So an important place to start here is to remember what Hamilton said regarding the Bill of Rights. Hamilton assumed perhaps the worst opinion of people in the future. He said of the Bill of Rights that he didn't support the Bill of Rights when they were written. And the reason why he didn't support the Bill of Rights is because he thought at some time in the future, however he defined that, someone would look at the Bill of Rights and make the argument that these were the only rights that the founders of the nation wished to be protected because they were enumerated. And so at some point in the future, someone could say something akin to, there exists no right to privacy, because if the founders had wanted it to be there, they would have put it explicitly within the Bill of Rights. So Hamilton's warning regarding the Bill of Rights sort of helps an evolution to get us to the Ninth Amendment. And the Ninth Amendment says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In essence, the Bill of Rights is not an exhaustive list of rights. That is not the entire containment of all rights that mankind possesses as inherent. that there exist other rights that are not enumerated in the text that can still be seen to be protections that the people hold and that the Constitution itself will help them defend. So even in the absence of that specific enumeration, we can still retain certain rights, one of which, as we will eventually get to in this class, is very clearly the right to privacy. The right to privacy, however, is one of the easier rights to point to the Constitution and say that it possibly was there. And that's because, as you can see, the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and 14th Amendment, all of these amendments contain certain elements of privacy. While there's no explicit articulation of privacy, and the word privacy appears nowhere within the Constitution itself, each of these amendments contains an element of privacy to it. So within the First Amendment, the right of individuals to assembly contains an element of privacy. The Third Amendment's prohibition on the quartering of soldiers contains an element of privacy, especially within one's home. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures contains an element of privacy, and privacy in terms of our content. The Fifth Amendment's prohibition against double jeopardy and a requirement of due process of law also maintains elements of privacy of thought, of privacy of articulation. And the 14th Amendment, ubiquitously its Equal Protection Clause, requires that states must equally protect these rights. And therefore, through all of these, we see sort of elements of privacy. While there's no particular very specific articulation of the Constitution protects the right to privacy, there are elements which impinge upon this idea that privacy exists somewhere within the document. And many states, quite particularly in their own constitution, protect an inherent right to privacy. So it isn't as though privacy is something that developed out of nowhere. This concept of a right to privacy existed for our founders, was understood to exist to our founders, and was very clear in documents of the time and documents of state and corporation constitutions going forward. But the battle to get that privacy in the United States very explicitly, and so before the court actually articulates that there exists a broad understanding of the right to privacy, the evolution to get there starts primarily through sexual procreation and parenting rights and procreation rights. And that's where this idea of individual level privacy comes from, at least with regard to the evolution of the law in the United States.